Welcome to our high story about Japan. Today we're going to be writing on line paper. So if you can get a piece of line paper out, go ahead and put your name and period in the upper right hand corner. Then on the top line at the title, you can go ahead and write High Story Japan Notes. And then on that first line, you can go ahead and put what we're going to be talking about today, which is going to be fascinating facts about Japan. I'm going to go ahead and put that in a highlight, and you should put a box around it to indicate that that's our topic for today. All right, the first thing we're going to talk about today is the population of Japan. Population of Japan is approximately 170 million people. Just to give you an idea of how many people that is, the United States has a population of approximately 325 million. So a little over a third of the population of the United States. What's interesting about this is that Japan has much less area for all those people to live in. So the population density, that is the number of people per square mile, is much higher and more crowded in Japan. So the population density in Japan is 874 people per square mile, whereas in the United States, the population density is 94 people per square mile. And just to give you an idea of another place to compare to, Australia is 2 people per square mile. So if you imagine a classroom with 30 desks, and let's say that was the size of the United States, you could take 32 people, which is approximately 300, like each represents a million, and you could take 32 people and put those in those 30 desks, and that would be like the population density of the United States. Then you could take the United States. You could take Australia, which is approximately the same size as the continental United States, and you could put 2 people in those 30 desks, and that would be the population density of Australia. And then to compare what that might be like for Japan, it's approximately 1/30th of the area of the United States. So you would take one desk, and then you would put approximately 13 people on that one desk. And that 13 people on that one desk would be the population density of Japan. So as you can see, it's a lot more dense. Now let's take a look at what that might look like in Japan. So let's look at population density Japan. And it's actually even higher now. It says 899 people per square mile. My notes must be 1 year older. And then let's look at an image and see if anything interesting comes up with regard to that. So you can see these really cool maps which show you where that looks like. And then we can think about a little bit about like housing in Tokyo, which is the largest city in Japan, and you can see just how dense Tokyo is when you look at that. All right. Now, what's interesting about Tokyo is that those apartments, they have very cool ways that they look for how to save space. For example, oftentimes in some apartments, they will roll up their mats after sleeping on them and put them in the closet so that the sleeping area becomes a living area. And then when it's bedtime, they'll take those sleeping mats out and roll them out again. So this population density has had a huge impact on Japan's culture. Imagine those 13 people on that desk. What types of things would they need to do in order to have a well-functioning culture? Well, you would need to have cooperation, right? You would also need to be respectful. It would help a lot to be organized and to have the discipline to follow the rules so everybody can get along. And it turns out those key ingredients to Japanese culture help them to get along and have a well-functioning culture. Also in Japan, manners are very important. So there are rules for interaction in Japan. Now, some of these rules are going to sound familiar because they follow a lot of Confucianist principles that were imported from China. For example, the concept of bowing in Japan is very important. And in fact, depending on how important the person is that you are bowing to, you will bow lower to them. There are 4 main islands in Japan, and on those islands, what's very interesting about that is 77% of the people live in cities. So now what you do is you take that one desk with 13 people on it, and you keep in mind that also the vast majority of Japan is mountainous, which forces people to live in those cities. So then you take all those people and you put them in an even smaller portion of that desk. When you think about the food of Japan, the food is primarily seafood. Why would that be? Well, if you look up here and you use your inference abilities, you will see that they're islands. And so it's surrounded by the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and that means they can get a lot of their food from the sea. Then also rice and small farms, because land is at such a premium, those farms oftentimes tend to be small. This has also led Japan to be a trading nation. So they depend on goods from other places. This is called import and export. They import, bring things in, and they export things to other countries. And when their economy got really powerful in the 1980s especially, they were exporting a lot of technology to other countries. There are some interesting things about the language in Japan. The spoken language of Japanese is different from Chinese. It's very fascinating because it actually has no intonation. Every syllable is flat. So when you speak English, you'll notice that sometimes a part of a word will be said harder than another part. So for example, even the word English, you'll notice that we stress the first syllable, English. In Japanese, it doesn't work that way. It's just sort of flat all along. And if you listen to some Japanese speaking, you might listen and hear that. There's also different forms of written language. So one written form of language is called kanji, which is actually the same characters from China. So I have a friend who speaks Japanese, and when he traveled in China, when he got in trouble trying to communicate, he would actually just write down in kanji what he was trying to say because he speaks Japanese, and then they would be able to read what he was writing. So that's very interesting. And then the other thing that's interesting about it is that in Japan, there are multiple kinds of written language. So there's also a type of written language called hiragana, which uses an alphabet, which is very interesting, and it has syllables as well. And then they even have a whole nother form of written writing as well called katakana. Finally, architecture and religion. One of the things that's interesting about architecture is they also imported that concept of curved roofs from China. So some of the architecture in Japan is similar to that in China. So if you look at Japanese architecture, you can see these curved roofs, and you can see that it looks a little bit like some of the same types of architecture you saw in China. They, of course, added their own flourishes to make it uniquely Japanese. And there's also a really big emphasis on the elegant use of space. And that is, again, with regard to the fact that they have such high population density. And the native religion of Japan is called Shinto. This is the religion that was there from the people who were originally there. And that was a polytheistic religion, which based everything on natural spirits. But what's interesting is that Japan has also mixed in a heavy influence of other religions as well, in particular Buddhism, which came from India to China to Korea and then to Japan. And they started their own unique style of Buddhism called Zen Buddhism, is probably the most famous of the types of Buddhism that they've done. In any case, I hope you learned a lot about Japan. I'm really excited about teaching you more about it, and I hope these things help you as you start to do your project. Thanks for listening.